So, thinking about what's been going on around us, obviously some of these things are very familiar to people. Towards the sort of late 70s and early 80s, the end of a period of consensus about how our country should operate. And I'm using these terms of neoliberalism and coining it with Thatcher. Are they new terms to you? Neoliberalism. So yes, if it is. No. Okay. So what I'm effectively meaning around those areas is a growth of a set of politics predominantly coming out of the United States that argued the diminution of the state, that argued the use of private capital to control things, that argued for the restriction of workers' and individuals' rights and so on. And we saw that most graphically in Thatcher's years in Britain. During the same period, a huge growth in income inequality in the UK, and you may have come across studies like the Spirit Level, which look at the level of income inequality and how that impacts upon societies and how they argue that it generates a whole set of issues. Clearly, we are in a much more globalised economy, and I'm also quite interested in the ideas that recently looking at around, I don't know if people have come across a guy called Manuel Castells and the notions of network capitalism. So how the integration of computer technology and networks feeds with our own approaches to networking as human beings and develops a kind of a much more integrated approach to capitalism for those on the inside, but also a huge sort of set of people who are left on the outside of those networks. Some really interesting sets of work in which is showing the kind of ways that we get living cheek by jowl. And I nearly always notice this. Our office is in the university in Oxford Road, and we have to go out to a range of community centres from there. And it always strikes me how you can be in the centre of what is a really sort of wealthy city, in the centre of a kind of a wealthy organisation, and within 2-3 minutes of walking from my office, you're in communities of significant disadvantage and of big issues around them. And what Castells argues is that that's a feature of network capitalism, and as a feature of how they organise the structures of it. Really interesting stuff. Significant stratification, it seems to me. You've got a whole set of, a re-establishment of classes in a big way. And on being linked to that, this breakdown of community. And again, one of the things that strikes me, I've lived in Liverpool for about 35 years, and when I first lived there, it is and was one of the poorest cities in the country. It was very noticeable, the difference between Liverpool and, say, where I came from in Birmingham. Now that difference is marginal. And over that period of that 25 to 30 years, if I go around, I do go all around the northwest of the country, I do look after Newcastle and the northeast as well, what you see is communities that are by and large poverty stricken, in very large numbers. There are obviously areas of plenty, but large numbers of poverty stricken areas, and that's quite different to when I was young. It wasn't like that 35 years ago. And I think that sort of feeds in a kind of context that I wanted to think about adult education. So I've said already that I think funded adult education is concentrated on a very narrow skills agenda and this promise of a high-skill knowledge economy and jobs. And at the same time, there's reductions in other types of learning. There's a huge reduction in adult and community learning, both in terms of what's funded through government. The grants for adult and community learning have stayed the same since, I think, 2004 now. So there's a real effect of cutting back. In higher education, it seems to me, universities have become out of reach and seem to me to be concentrating on the young, that sort of, and we've seen a huge drop, I think, this year in mature students going. And then within the universities, there's a kind of stratification in there. So it matters, if you're going to be in the top elites, which university you go to. So if you go to the right universities and you've got the right courses, then your chances of entering and being in the right elites are significantly higher than if you go to what will be considered lower level universities. There's a big difference between the two. Interestingly as well, HE has kind of withdrawn from community education, and they used to call community education extramural, outside the walls departments of universities. They've become intramural. They're only interested in the sort of inside of it. And again, when you think about big universities like Manchester that occupy so much real estate in a big working class city like Manchester, you kind of think, how dare they sort of keep that sort of stuff in the directly in there, and the resources that they've got that we can't seem to share with communities. I think really interesting, political education is more or less non-existent. It used to exist in political parties. There used to be a variety of political parties of the left. There used to be discussions inside church groups and so on. There used to be cooperative groups. There were things like housing co-ops and stuff like that that also had a range of political education around them. And much of that has gone. I suggested in a Labour Party branch about a year ago that they might want to think about education, and their sort of response to it was what they wanted to educate us about was how to go canvassing. So it was again a kind of technical education, not about politics, if you know what I mean. And I suppose a question that kind of runs through everything I'm saying, is there a democratic deficit? In other words, are the things that are happening taken away from our ability to intervene and influence and change the things that are going on around us? What are the consequences of this? I think there's a very high variability in the standard and depth of education of adults at the minute. You undoubtedly get at the top of the tree in Britain some of the best education that it is available to get. We might argue about how that's delivered and all the rest of it, but there's some really good stuff out there. But then there's also some real dross, I'm afraid, and there's some really poor things that are taking place, and you can see it, you hear it, you talk about the consequences of it. Really high numbers of school leavers where the knowledge base is shallow. And in a sense, I'm sort of referring to those kinds of things where things don't seem to fit together again. And that's not people who haven't achieved qualifications, it's including people who've achieved the qualifications. So they're doing the qualifications and are still quite often unlinked. This was where higher education used to come in. I think some of that's always happened, but you used to be able to get a whole cohort of people into higher ed. If you've got to pay £9,000 a year, and if you're an adult, you know, with responsibilities, the chances of taking some of that on are getting progressively less. Poor education undoubtedly is concentrated on the most disadvantaged. You can see study after study of that. Of course, there are good examples here and there, but overwhelmingly, if you're poor and don't succeed, you don't succeed. And that sort of seems to repeat itself. I'm interested in this because this sort of idea of for us, for the WEA, is something that we've been working around for over a century. We kind of had independent-minded, working-class adults and from working-class backgrounds who didn't go to university, but about the ages of 25 typically started to think, you know what, there's something more to life than what I'm doing. I've enjoyed the last 10 years since I'm leaving school. I didn't like school. I've enjoyed that, but you know what, there's something more. And they start to think about it and wish to develop something more, but they're not sure what some of the time. Sometimes it takes a few years to get some of that sorted out. I suppose I'm asking, where do they now go? And what access do they have for some of that teaching and learning? And again, if those people in those kinds of communities, in my experience when I was younger, those people became the community leaders and activists that changed things inside the places that they were doing. If they're not able to do that, there's another question about whether there's a democratic deficit. Does it stop changing precisely those places where we probably